Hey guys, what's up? This is Nachos, and in this video I'm going to show you guys how you can exploit the pool by using more aggressive strategies. If you like the content, don't forget to leave a thumbs up, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to join our Discord server. There's a link in the comments down below. In that Discord server I'll share a deck of Anki cards that we created for the guys that are in the CFP, and we're going to share them with you guys as well so you can improve your second barreling strategies. All right, let's dive in. So first of all, I want to show you guys a little bit of theory, a short presentation, and then we're just going to dive into a bunch of hands that are from one of my students, where I just review how he's playing the second barrel line, and I'll tie everything that is in the presentation into practical examples. All right, so first of all, why do we barrel? Well, with any betting range in No Limit Hold'em, there is always a reason why, right? If we don't have any good hands, let's say we only have 7 deuce offsuit, our opponent only has aces, and the board is 8-8-8-8, then we will never bet, right? So there's always a reason, a part of your range that wants to bet. And in this situation, your opponent is check raising his strong hands on the flop versus our c-bet. He is folding his air on the flop, so he usually has more of the middle of the range. Top pair, middle pair, some lower pairs, some ace highs, some king highs. We generally still have the top of our range, and we have a ton of hands in the bottom of the range. If we are range betting, then we also have a lot of stuff in the middle of our range. If we just go with a polar sizing on the flop, then we are already kind of polar. But because our opponent's range is condensed and we have the top and the bottom of our range, we are incentivized in betting the top of our range to make money versus our opponent's quote-unquote bluff catchers. And then we have to add in some bluffs to incentivize the out of position player to be calling sufficiently. This is, in a nutshell, the strategy explained. All right, so now let's dive into bet sizing. There is basically one core principle that lies behind the bet size that we want to choose as the in-position player. And in a very simple way, you could say the more your overpairs are worth a lot, the more you want to bet. So if you take these two board textures, Jack, 7, 3, deuce, then you still have the top of the range advantage. All of those hands that were very good on the flop are now still very good. Your opponent doesn't really have a lot of very strong hands. He mostly has hands like a 7, a Jack, and maybe some pocket pairs, some ace highs. And so, as you can see in the equity chart, you're going to have the advantage in the top of the range, and you want to leverage that by betting large, forcing your opponent into indifference with hands like a 7, some weaker jacks maybe, kind of depending on the formation that you're in. And you just want to maximally extract value with your ace jack, your pocket queens, etc. If you take the other texture, the second texture, now on an 8, both players make a ton of flushes and straights and some 2 pairs. And your pocket queens isn't worth as much. Now, it's not necessarily that your pocket queens isn't worth as much, but it's a very useful mental framework. Ask yourself, how much is my pocket queens worth, my overpair worth, and how much do I want to bet with my overpair? That section of the range that had a massive advantage on the flop now gets devalued, and so you want to size down. So on dry textures, we generally want to overbet. On more drawy textures, we generally want to go and bet somewhere between half pot and 80% of the pot. On the most drawy textures, like 4 straight and 4 flush, you'll see that you usually start block betting. There will be some overbets there as well, but usually you choose a block bet or an overbet sizing. All right, so now let's dive into some data, and then we're going to go into some hands played by my student to identify some leaks by him potentially, and tie all of this together into some cool, useful strategies. So first of all, it's important to recognize that the pool doesn't really overfold versus second barrels. Usually we're going to be betting 3/4 of the pot, or 150% of the pot, so 3/4 or overbet. And the pool actually defends quite well versus those sizes. This does change a little bit when you're looking at some pools that are playing weaker. Let's say you're playing micro stakes Russian cash, then there might be some overfolds, but generally speaking, all pools combined, not really an overfold. The overfold only becomes apparent when we size down, which we don't really do unless we play on the most drawy of textures. On some paired textures you can go and size half pot. On 4 flush and 4 straight textures you can size quarter pot, and then there's an overfold. And on those textures you might want to cheat a little bit and increase the betting frequency, but overall there's no real overfold. And generally we want to play a strategy that's more or less reasonable. There is an overfold in the bet line only when you size bet 75 or smaller. If you size larger, then you already push out a bunch of the air in villain's range on the turn, and then the pool ends up defending appropriately on the river. For solvers this doesn't really matter, like it will more or less give away the same percentage of the pot on the river, whether there's an overbet on the turn or not. For the pool there is a difference. If you overbet the turn, then they are better able to defend on the river. If you size down on the turn, then a slight overfold becomes apparent. Now there's some river lines that happen when you check back. Bet check bet is one of them. There's an overfold. Bet check raise, there's an overfold, by the way. So when you check back, you should be thinking about a couple of things. One of them is if you face another check on the river, auto bluff, mostly, right? Obviously, versus some players, you might want to be more balanced. If you're playing 1K or 2K, then you might want to have some balance, and you might not want to auto bluff, but you want to maybe put all the mixed frequency bluffs into pure bluffs. But if you check back, then mostly you want to bluff the bet check bet line. Bet check raise line, I would raise more as well and go with the mixed frequencies and raise them pure. And then we have the check back, and then we face a bet. That is very player dependent. On a lot of textures, you should expect your opponent to auto bluff in theory. So if you check back the turn, what ends up happening is that you mostly have the air part of your range. If you remember on the first slide, we showed that this is kind of what the ranges look like in a very simplified form. Now at the top of your range, you're mostly betting. The middle of your range, you're checking, and then some of the bottom of your range, you're checking. If you check back, then you just have an abundance of air now in your range. So you have a more air heavy range, which means that your opponent will have to bluff automatically unless the river changes the board significantly. So let's say you check back a bunch of ace highs. Now the river is an ace, that changes the board. And so if you check back, your opponent is not allowed to auto bluff. Generally speaking, if you check back, your opponent should auto bluff. And there can be specific exploits versus specific players. For instance, you know that your opponent is betting the river very seldomly. He has a very low river bet stat, or he has a very low win when so flop. Then checking back a bit more might be useful, because he's not going to automatically bluff his air, and you'll get an even larger overfold in the bet check bet line. Now we'll tie all of this together in some practical examples where we just go over 20, 30 hands that were played by one of my students. And then we'll try to come up with some exploitative strategies by just going over hands. We'll bring in some solves and whatnot. All right, so here we are with the replayer. We are just going to speed run through a bunch of hands that our opponent played here. So here we get a cold call from the small blind after raising 2.5x. These stakes, this is micro stakes. I don't think there's much reason to develop a cold calling range unless the big blind is a recreational. Rake is too high, you want to play 3-bet or fold. When our opponent doesn't do that, we might infer that he is a recreational. Our opponent, our hero bets 3/4 here. If you're going to bet this sizing, then you don't really want to bet this hand. Maybe you can bet some lower pocket pairs with a diamond, but not without a diamond. Generally speaking, I would just go and bet small here though. We get a call. We hit a jing card on the turn. All right, now that we're here and we bet large and our opponent didn't check raise, we can discount the amount of pocket 9s, pocket 10s, king 10, queen jack type of hands. So because there was a straight out on the board and he will check raise a bunch of those straights, if not all of his straights on the flop, he is sufficiently capped and we can go with a large sizing here. I think what we want to do is go 2E, meaning you're betting the same size on turn and river to make sure that you're all in. Not entirely sure what that would be, but slight overbet I think would be the play here. And we get a pot size bet, which is close enough, I think, and our opponent folds. Right, so here on this board you can go overbet and check. You can go 3/4 and check. You could range bet. Range betting costs you a little bit of EV, but it's a lot simpler. And if you're playing micro stakes or low stakes, I would probably recommend to make sure that you've got that sorted first. So our hero goes with 3/4, which is reasonable. We get a call. Turn is interesting. Both players have a ton of aces, and so we generally, when the board pairs, we want to be somewhat careful, especially if they're betting large. On a king or 5 in particular, opponents should have leads, because we are not going to bet a king or a 5 for the sizing on the flop very often. Sometimes, but not very often. On an ace, it's a little bit different because we are betting a ton of aces. We are going to have ace, king, and king still. But I think I would size down to bet 75 because our opponent has a ton of aces. We have a ton of aces. If we go very large, then he's only going to have to call the aces. If we go and bet 75, then he still needs to call some kings and some 5s potentially. So that's what I would do. He calls, that's fine. And then on the river, we just want to pick a sizing here. Like we could go and have some all-ins with our range because again, we have kings and ace-king. Our opponent doesn't have those. We have pocket 5s. Our opponent doesn't have that at this moment because he's usually check raising that at the flop. So I think we are going to have some all-ins here or very large sizes, and then we're going to have a bet 75 sizing. I think our hand probably is okay in both, but more so in the bet 75 sizing. I don't know what we do. This is too small of a sizing. This is just a waste of opportunity. You just want to make sure that you bet 75 and make some ace-4 type hand indifferent, I would guess. This is letting our opponent off easily. And he folds, which, yeah, doesn't say much. Here, king 8, 6, we want to go range bet small, which is what we do. It's fine. On the turn, queen is a pretty decent card for our range. We are going to bet a bunch of queens on the flop because we range bet. Our opponent is going to fold most of them as he's defending more hands that connect with the 6 and the 8. So like 9-10, 9-7, an 8, a 6, a king, some ace highs, but most of the queen highs will fold. And on top of that, we are going to have pocket queens, king, queen, which your opponent doesn't have at the same frequency. So pretty decent card. We're going to bet reasonably often. Our hand can either bet or can check. It doesn't really matter that much. When you hold a club, so one of the suits that's not on the board, generally you're allowed to bet a little bit more often, although I think in this case, ranges are still relatively wide. It's kind of a niche thing and not very important. Either way is fine here, I think. We check, which is fine. And now our opponent should be bluffing at a very high frequency. We have kind of an interesting spot. If you want to go full exploit, I think you just want to bet large here and just force your opponent to make a tough decision. We know that there's a reasonable overfold here. Your ace jack is going to check back for a reasonable amount. You have to weigh those two things. Your check is worth something. Your bet gets more than it otherwise would in equilibrium. And so this becomes kind of close. I think if you have a weaker ace, you want to bet mostly. If you have this, then checking is fine. Yeah. Interesting board here. We want to check at a very high frequency. We generally want to go bet 50 or check on boards where there's a straight possible. It's very useful simplification. On this texture, I would just check my entire range because 8 high and lower textures where straight is possible, you can generally get away with checking your entire range, especially if you expect your opponent to just play a normal probing strategy on the turn. One of the exploits that he would use if we check our entire range here as the out of position player is probe significantly less often because we still have sets, we still have straights, we still have aces, kings, queens in our checking range at full frequency, and therefore he's not allowed to probe as often as he would when we do have a betting range. Now, in practice, I think your opponent is actually going to probe more than he should, and so that plays into checking your entire range here. Our hero bets 1/3, which is okay-ish. It can be okay if you mix bet 30 and check, but then you gotta make sure that you're balanced with your checking range, which is a lot harder to achieve. Hands like this should make it into your checking range quite often. If you don't make sure that there's sufficient flush draws in your checking range, for instance, then your opponent can exploit that potentially. And that's something that I would exploit if I was playing, let's say, the 200 Russian cash pool, and you see someone either bet small or check back here, specifically when they check back and there's a flush closing turn. I think their ranges are going to lack flushes, and I would exploit that as the out of position player. All right, so we bet small. We get a 4 straight. This is a texture where our opponent probably should have some leads. I want to stress test that assumption, but generally speaking, that is the case. If you bet small though, that leading range will probably be relatively small because both ranges are still pretty wide. There's still a reasonable amount of air in your range. There's a reasonable amount of weaker hands in your opponent's range. So for instance, stuff like ace queen will call versus the small bet. Some king queen, king jack type hands will call, especially with backdoors. Not as good of a turn for your opponent, and therefore there will be some leads I expect, but not an awful lot of leads. We'll see what he does. He checks. I think betting and checking are both reasonable options. I would lean slightly more towards checking because I expect our opponent to miss the fact that he should have some leads here. Either way is fine. Our opponent, our hero makes a good check, which is good. We get a large bet, and here we got to think about the pool. We're playing Russian cash, micro stakes. Is our opponent finding the bluffs that he should? Like, he should be finding some bluffs with missed hearts. We blocked that, that's not great. It's like some ace 8 of hearts, for instance, ace 10 of hearts, that's not 3-betting pre-flop. We don't have the best bluff catcher, that's 1. And then 2, 4 straight turns are generally underbluffed on the river. So this is kind of iffy. I have a pure bluff catcher here in a pool that's not finding enough bluffs. I don't beat value, so I would just fold. We see a call, and no surprise, our opponent has a value hand here. Alright, so here we play versus a recreational, which changes the dynamics a little bit. You can do whatever you want, you just want to bet, I think, versus a recreational here. We think he's a recreational because he's not sitting full stacked and he cold calls a small blind. You want to bet because you're not getting check raised often enough, and you want to just build a pot with a flush draw. I would go bet, bet, and then give up if I miss, bet, bet, and jam if I hit. Very simple strategy. This is fine. On a 9, our ace high does do okay. So the relative value of your ace high, or your high card hands, goes up if the board runs out paired, because, well, he doesn't have as many cards he can connect with. And also the 9, if he has a 9 now, he was already beating our ace high, but now it's less likely that he has a 9 because there are 2 on the board. If there are 4 on the board, he can't have them. If there's 1 on the board, obviously the chances are larger that he has a 9 than when there are 2 or 3 on the board. All right, anyway. We check back, which I like, and then on the river here, this is relatively close versus a recreational. Not an ideal spot to be in. I think versus pot I would fold, versus half pot I would call, versus 3/4 it's neither here nor there. I would fold here. I think that's fine. Interesting situation here. So we have a combo draw on a paired texture. I would block bet small here with my entire range. Our opponent should check raise very often on these paired textures. I think they're going to miss that, and especially at low stakes, I expect them to over check raise their 10x, and mainly because they're not going to find enough random air type hands that they should mix in. So the check raising range will be too equity driven. There will be too many draws, open enders, stuff like that in there. There won't be enough air type hands in there, and there will be too much 10x in there. So we'll see what happens here. We get a call. This also means that our opponent is now capping himself more than he should. I think this is especially true in Russian cash games, where people are generally a bit more inclined to play the strength of their hand a bit too much. They're not playing too complicated strategies. All right, so here I think we just want to bet mostly in practice. Like I said, we expect our opponent not to have a 10 very often here, because mostly he will be check raising them, and solvers will actually check call them quite frequently. So I would just bet and bet the majority of the times here. I think checking, in theory, checking is probably not a mistake. You're going to have some checkbacks with flush draws, so you have some flushes on flush closing rivers. I think that's reasonable. I think with the amount of equity that we have and the fact that we have 7 high, so we don't really want to get closer to showdown, as we don't really win on showdown, would be reasons enough for me to just bet myself. Here we river a flush. I think I just bet 3/4. The annoying thing is that our opponent is not going to be check raising enough, regardless of the player type, on most stakes. So in these lines, they should be check raising kind of depending on the sizing, but on average it's going to be 10-15% or something like that, and they're significantly under that. If they don't check raise you often enough, then you don't want to rely on your opponent for putting money into the pot, if that makes sense. Solvers will check raise significantly more, and so solvers as the in-position player will also have hands like, I don't know, pocket nines or some 10x or some flushes into a smaller betting sizing, and will generally you just use 1 or 2 sizings here. Kind of a middle catch-all sizing of bet 50, bet 75 is often used in bet check bet lines. And it will be very balanced, so the top of the range will make it in there, and some bluffs will make it in there, and some thinner value bets will make it in there, all kind of using one single sizing or like 2 sizings that are relatively close to one another. In practice, I think we can be a bit more creative and put some larger bets out there so that we can leverage the fact that we have some strong hands, and leverage the fact that we can underprotect our smaller sizing a little bit, because our opponent won't put us to the test by check raising, and at the same time make a little bit more with the top of a range. All right, so I think I would just go with bet 75 here because it's a paired texture and my flush isn't that great. But if I had a stronger flush or maybe a boat, I would just size up and maybe bet larger than a pot. We get a check back. I'm not sure that our hero is probably not thinking about this. Caught up with doing something else, I'm assuming misclicking, whatever, because I'm pretty certain that he knows that he should be betting here. Anyway, we move on to the next hand. Here on this low disconnected texture, this functions quite similar to how you should be overbetting the turn on some dry disconnected textures. On low textures, you want to basically overbet as well and leverage the fact that your opponent has a bunch of pairs. You have the overpair advantage, and so generally you want to size a little bit larger. On lower stakes, I think it's fine to just range bet these. If you haven't studied all of the future notes, like second barreling, phasing a probe, delayed c-betting, raising probes, all of the subsequent lines that come after checking back the flop here, then it makes sense to just range bet and take the EV loss. You're playing a strategy, if you range bet here, that is 97% accurate, as in you lose 3% of the pot. No, 3%, not of the pot, but 3% difference between range bet and the optimal strategy, which would be bet 75 and check here. So if you haven't studied subsequent turn lines, then you want to be range betting. I would go bet 75 and check here, and presumably our hero does the same. This is an interesting spot. So we are not really going to be betting 6x at any meaningful frequency, right? If we go bet 75 on the flop, then we want to have a decent checking range. We're not going to bet our entire range for bet 75. And then hands like 6x, 3x, pocket 5s, pocket 7s, pocket 8s, those are going to be making it into the checking line alongside some air that we don't really want to bet because we don't want to bet over air. Otherwise, we would be betting way too often. And some hands like ace king, ace queen that want to go one street close to the showdown as well. So we are not going to be betting a 6 very often, but our opponent is going to call a 6 pretty much always. He's going to fold it sometimes, I'm assuming, but mostly he's going to call it, and then more importantly, he's going to fold a bunch of his air. So his range consists of a 3, a 6, a 9, some draws, occasional high card hand that is very strong, but that's about it. So he has a very condensed range, and this 6 now gives him a very significant trips advantage. So he should be leading here, which our opponent is not doing, and this is something that I would expect my opponent not to be aware of when I was playing low stakes, no limit hold'em. And so when I get a check here, I'm just going to assume that he doesn't understand that he should be leading, and he's just checking his entire range. Because he's checking his entire range, he's checking all of the trips that he has, where he has an advantage as well. And so the best thing I can do is check back a lot here. And I would probably check back my kings the majority of the times here, and then let my opponent give me information on the strength of his hand on the river. I would have a very low betting frequency here, maybe 30% or something like that, maybe even less. You could potentially bet your pocket kings occasionally, but definitely wouldn't auto bet my pocket kings here. You can see that our hero sizes down, which is okay on a pairing turn. I think in this particular case, you just want to be checking very, very aggressively or passively, kind of. Yeah. Anyway, so we get a bet. We bet. Our opponent calls. Think it's relatively unlikely it is a 6 now when he calls the smaller bet. So I would feel a lot better about this situation right now. We get a check. Now I'm just going to, I'll always bet the river, probably go for something like 3/4, 2/3 of the pot or something like that. Never using this sizing. This is a mistake. You just want the size, let's say between half pot and 3/4 I can live with. Going smaller doesn't really make too much sense because we just want to make something like a weak 9 indifferent here on the river. By this, using this sizing, a 9 has just a very easy call. Basically, our hands that want to bet are pocket 10s and better at this point, some 6x, and so we want to go with a sizing that reflects that range. We don't really want to bet, let's say 9-8 here to make him call pocket 7s or like, I don't know, like 7-8 or something like that. Oh, so 7-8 straight. Like you get the point. Like some weaker pair or some random ace high, which he doesn't really have very often. Anyway, he has a bunch of 9s. We want to get money out of those 9s, and so we bet larger here than this. Yeah, so you can see that he would have at least have a tougher decision when you bet back 2/3 here or something like that. He probably would have called mostly, as he should, but you would have made a 9 indifferent here if you bet larger here, and that would be basically when you're sizing, you want to think, okay, what is the bulk of my value betting range in relationship to the calling range of my opponent, and what sizing reflects that. So let's say you go all in here, you can just fold every 9. That's not a good sizing, right? And the bulk of your value betting range is going to consist of a king or an overpair here. So you want to size something like I said, half pot, 3/4 probably after the turn sizing, maybe a little bit larger, and just put a 9 into the bin. Right. Interesting board. So we should go half pot and check here. Betting quite often, but well, let's say just pure with the diamonds. I think that's probably reasonable. You might need to check back some straights here, but particularly 8-6, I think you'd want to check back. Jack 8, I would probably just always bet. We size slightly larger, which is okay. Again, our opponent should have a leading range on the turn here. We are not going to bet a 7 very often. Our opponent is going to call them pretty much always. Although like some naked 7x, like 5-7 or something like that might fold. 5-7 of spades. We still bet it much less often than our opponent is calling it, so villain should be leading. He doesn't do that. We should be careful. I think checking back is reasonable here. As we said, villain should be leading the turn, so being more careful with our betting range makes sense. Being careful makes sense. We do have a very strong hand, right? So I'm not saying go pure check with this. You should be betting, I think, the majority of the time still. Extracting value from a 7 still. Some 10x, some 9x, some draws potentially. So betting mostly with your hand is probably better, but checking occasionally is fine. We get a bet here, half pot. I don't think my opponent is ever going to be balanced to the point where he is betting a boat for half pot here. I think this is just generally very weak and too weak, this sizing. And then sometimes there's going to be some value hand mixed in there, but usually a very weak value hand. So I would raise here, and I like this sizing, that's fine. Your opponent will overfold massively. So if you have air here, hammer like there's no tomorrow. Right, so here either we go range bet for a small sizing, or we go with more polar sizing. This kind of in-between sizing you can probably get away with, like but it's not very standard. I would just go ahead and range bet, I think, if I was a hero here. We get a call. Turn is a 9. Our opponent is going to call Jack 10 quite often, so he makes a ton of very strong hands here, which means that the top of a range isn't the nuts anymore. I think that's like the cleanest way of saying it. So when the top of your range isn't the nuts anymore, generally speaking, there's some exceptions to this, but generally speaking, you want to go with a 3/4 and check sizing, which is what I would do. I think this hand might actually bet sometimes, weirdly enough, as some sort of a value bluff type hand. I'm not entirely sure. I'll pull up a sim in a second, but I think mostly we're just going to check here, which is what we do. And on the river, if we face a check, we want to check back. Now that we face a bet, it's pretty close. We don't beat value. We beat all bluffs, so we have a pure bluff catcher. Our bluff catcher is pretty good here. This is a spot, however, where our opponents should auto bluff, and I don't necessarily think that the pool will do that. He is sitting at a non-full stack, so if this is recreational, I would probably call. If this is a regular, I would hate live a little bit and probably just fold, because I think we're going to be indifferent in equilibrium, and he's probably not finding all the bluffs that he should be finding, so I would probably overfold here. And we get a fold, which is, I think, good. We'll pull up a sim to see what we should be doing on the turn with our hand. So here we are with a sim. We can see any sizing is sort of fine. Like I said, usually the way people play this is by either going polar or by going small. You can just bet your entire range, you'd be fine. You're not losing too much EV, which is why small sizing is fine. And then generally, if someone chooses a different strategy, then they usually go bet 75 or 125. Anyway, our hero goes half pot here, call, and then the turn is a 9, a rainbow 9. So 9 of spades. And I just want to see, like, are we ever doing that, like, merge betting? Yeah, so these jack 9s are betting at a reasonable frequency, 9-10 betting sometimes. And let's say we do bet that sizing, then we get some calls by ace jack, which is good. There's not really flush draws. We get calls by 9-10 occasionally, so we get some calls by weaker. We make some better folds. It's kind of like a weird in-between betting type hand where you just bet because you have a reasonable amount of equity. And potentially like you make some trips on a 9, for instance, so the 9 is not as bad on the river or something like that, but not too important. I think just checking is fine. This is a texture where you can probably go a half pot and check. Half pot with your entire range, or you just go small with your entire range, I would say, which is what hero does. I think that's fine. This is an interesting turn. 4 straight turn, we generally want to go and bet very small so that we can still bet, let's say, some very good one pair hands, or we want to go and overbet, kind of depending on the type of 4 straight. I think we mostly want to go small here, is what I would guess, but I'm not entirely sure. I would check this probably, although going small is probably reasonable as well. And we get a pot size bet. This is kind of gross. Again, versus the pool on the 4 straight turn, which is under bluffed, I would probably just fold. There aren't any, like, you've got to ask yourself, where do the bluffs come from here? There's some pocket pairs that he needs to change into a bluff. There's some hearts that he needs to change into a bluff, but I don't think that's enough to justify calling here. We do call, the opponent has a 10. In these games, I would, like these low stakes Russian cash games, I would probably just overfold in these spots where there's like a ton of value. It's not an awful lot of bluffs. I think it was something like this, right? No, it's ace, king of hearts, queen of spades. We bet small, that's fine. Jack of clubs, 4 of diamonds. Jack of clubs, might be some leading here. Yeah, so some leading. 4 straights, there generally is a reasonable amount of leading because the out of position player calls hands that connect with this board, where the in position player is betting is whatever 6-7 of clubs sometimes, right, on the flop. So we just bet everything here. Our opponent is calling just like hands that connect with the cards that are on the board and folds all of his air. And so when the turn connects with the cards that are already on the board, there's generally some leading because it's generally very good for the out of position player, especially if it's a 4 straight. So you can go to turn reports here and you'll see some pairing cards, maybe some leading. Like on a queen, I could see some leading or something like that. Minuscule amount of leading. Some flushes, there's leading. These are very cool. You can go polar on these flushes. And this is just a function of the out of position player having more flushes in his range. Anyway, jacks leading, 10s leading. We face a jack. We are just mainly going to check back. Now that let me show you how this works. 40% is actually the sizing that hero used, more or less. Jack of clubs, right? And we saw that there should be some leading here for the out of position player. We can expect our opponent not to lead, right? If our opponent doesn't lead, then going again with 40% is the correct sizing and we get the bet quite often. If he doesn't lead, well, there's a leading option. If we remove the leading option altogether, In other words, we just expect our opponent to completely disregard the option of leading. He's just checking his entire range. Then that will reduce the amount of betting for the in-position player, because now all of those stronger hands that would otherwise sometimes make it into a betting range are now being grouped into a checking range. In other words, if your opponent is leading sometimes but chooses to check, then the check is weaker than when he just checks his entire range. All right, let's see. We can see betting frequency goes down by 15%. Ace-Jack mostly going to be checking. So yeah, more or less correct there. And then the river on the 4 of diamonds. When he goes pot, I think we're probably already indifferent, because we'll see. So we can see he should be checking his tens sometimes, right? And he should be betting all of his air always for the sizing. I just don't think that's happening. Let's see, is there like all these pocket pairs, or all these, some lower pairs are even, well, let's see, some 4x. He should be betting always. He's not going to be doing that. Unmade hands always betting. I think this is not happening, and I also think that checking 1/3 of the straights is quite unlikely. I think he's betting more of the straights, generally speaking, and less of the pairs. All right, so we face pot. We are indifferent in equilibrium. Doesn't really matter what we do, but because we expect our opponent not to find the bluffs and find the value a little bit too often, for the sizing, we just fold. All right, so here we go, and generally want to just go and range bet again for small sizing. I think if I could give one advice to Hero, I would probably say just simplify your flop strategy a bit more. You could go and do whatever on textures like this, and probably some 3/4 is fine as well. Your opponent is going to have 16, actually 12 combinations of maybe a little bit more of straights. Let's pull it up real quick so I can show you what I mean. Ace of hearts, king, queen, check, strategy. So you can see you can do whatever. You can go and bet larger, you can bet smaller, but just probably bet your range and simplify. You're not going to be losing too much EV here if you just go ahead and bet your entire range. I'll show you. Let's say that we pick between the strategy that Hero chooses, so like a more polar strategy, 2/3 here. And now we're saying, no, I don't want you to go 2/3. I want you to go and bet small with range. Let's look at the EV for imposition. EV for imposition now is 3.38. Can we compare? Yes, EV 3.38 versus 3.42. So you're losing like 1% or something like that. In other words, you can range bet, you get 99% of the EV that you otherwise capture by choosing a more complex strategy like this. 99%, right? And you are not going to be making any mistakes. The only reason why I could see us wanting to go and polarize the flop is if we think we can play it better than our opponent does. The problem that we have is that generally low stakes players play the checking line as the imposition player very, very poorly, and so we probably just want to mitigate that. Don't really think about that at all. Just range bet, and then later on we want to polarize more. I think I kept range betting until I was playing 10-20 on textures like this. Hell, I played today 10-20, and I was range betting textures like this for sure. So I'm not saying there isn't EV to be gained over equilibrium if you go and choose a strategy like this, but generally speaking, you want to be a bit careful. Right, so we face a check, and here Hero overbets. We don't really want to overbet, especially not when we block a king as well. I think what we'd want to do is probably make. All right, so let's look at what has happened. We bet large on the flop, and turn brings in the 4 straight. We are going to have some Jack X. Our opponent is going to have a fair amount of Jack X. Quite likely you should have a leading range. That's one. I think our opponent will have more Jack X than us because we are betting 6-5 of spades occasionally for this sizing, and our opponent is never calling it. Meaning that his range connects more with the board than our range does. So I don't necessarily think that we should be betting very often here to begin with. That's one. 2, like the fact that it's a higher 4 straight is a little bit better for us because our opponent is 3-betting a bunch of the Jack X, Queen X, King X, Ace X hands pre-flop, so that makes it a little bit better. Having said that, I still think we need to check quite often. Then we want to think of, do we want to check straights here? generally the answer is no, but on forced trades or textures where your opponent has some very strong hands as well, so like let's say flush closing turns, paired turns, you can check straights quite often. So this would be a texture where I expect my straights to not always bet. Then I want to think, okay, what kind of hands do I want to, what kind of straights do I want to check? Probably the straights that block some of the 2-pair combinations in our opponent's range. So probably ace-jack would be one that I would want to check. King-jack probably one. And then I would bet more with the hands like jack-9 or jack-8, jack-7, jack-6. Doesn't mean that betting here necessarily is a mistake, but I would be leaning more towards a check. And then the sizing that I would pick, probably I would go smaller. Because if we bet very large here, we're saying mostly call with your jacks, and we are mostly betting a jack. We know that opponent has more jacks than us because of the fact that we are betting at a higher frequency on the flop with a whole bunch of stuff, and our opponent has a higher concentration of jacks here. His range, percentage of the range that is a straight is probably higher here. So let's see if that's the case. We'll make this the last hand of this video. So we'll go into here. Okay, ace, king, queen. We bet, let's say we do an AI solve, right? So we go and 2/3, which is fine. It's not a mistake, right? But, and then 10 of clubs, I think. So again, expect to be seeing a small leading frequency, although in white formation maybe, yeah, okay, a little bit, right? Why? Well, hands in position actually has more straights, but still there's like a little bit of leading because we have more air. So let's see, 2-pair, top pair, yeah, cool. All right, anyway, you can see some block betting to leverage the fact that this is relatively decent card for the out of position player after going large on the flop, because the out of position player just calls hands that connect with this board on the flop a bit more, right? So if you go here, all of these like weaker stuff is just folding, whereas in Hero's betting range it's still in there, and therefore now out of position gets the lead at a very minuscule frequency. You can just cut it out completely. Anyway, we check. And we can see we want to bet 40% here, relatively decent frequency, but we want to be able to bet like some top pairs, even some 2-pairs sets. And we want to bet these to make sure that we get leverage the fact that we don't just focus on the straights. We get to bet some sets and 2-pairs as well, which we're going to have an advantage in. So because we, like our opponent is, I don't know, like 3-betting ace king, ace queen quite often pre-flop, and ace 10 pre-flop. So we're going to have a decent advantage there, and we want to leverage that. Now let's say we do what our hero does, which is bet 1.5x, and let's see what the EV difference is there. So now you can see you're just betting 17.5% of the times. You don't really bet sets or straights anymore, like you have very low frequency, and the EV difference is like almost like 8% or something like that, so quite substantial here. If we are betting a straight, I'm just going to guess that we just mainly want to bet the straights, like I said, jack 8, jack 7, the straights that don't block a pair that's on the board, because, well, we want our opponent to be able to call with ace 10, ace king, queen, stuff like that. Let's say we go and overbet here. You can see that the calling range for opponent is occasional top pair, 2-pairs, right? And we want to unblock these if we bet large, so that we make it more likely that he actually calls, and then some straights as well. So not too impressed by this overbet, but hey, we are dealing with a low stakes player that really wants to make it in poker. And if I look at my own career and I look through my own database, even like of last months, there will be plenty of punts in there, let alone if I go like six years back in time. For now, if you guys have any questions, drop them in the comments down below. Like I said, there's a link to our Discord channel where I'll be sharing a deck of flashcards that I created that can help you navigate these spots a little bit better. And for now, if you're playing today, good luck at the tables, and talk to you guys soon. Bye.